You were 7 years old when you learned that adults lie, 8 when you realized nobody was coming to save you, 9 when you started managing other people's emotions because they couldn't manage their own. And somewhere between childhood and adolescence, you stopped being a child altogether, not because you wanted to, but because someone had to be the adult, and the actual adults in your life couldn't do it. So you became responsible, serious, hyper-capable. You learned to suppress your needs, anticipate crises, and carry weight that should never have been placed on small shoulders. People praised you for it. They called you mature, wise beyond your years, an old soul, as if losing your childhood was something to celebrate. And now, decades later, you're realizing something painful. You never got that time back. The carefree years, the protected innocence, the luxury of just being a kid, they're gone. And you're still carrying the psychological imprint of growing up too fast. Today, we're breaking down the psychology of parentified children, the ones who had to be adults before their brains were ready, the ones who raised themselves, raised their siblings, or even raised their own parents. And we're going to talk about the 6 psychological traits you develop that are both your greatest strengths and your deepest wounds. Let's start with the most obvious one. When you grow up too fast, you develop what psychologists call hyperresponsibility. This isn't just about being responsible, it's about feeling responsible for everything and everyone all the time. You can't relax when there's a problem to solve. You can't enjoy yourself when someone else might need you. You can't rest because rest feels like abandonment, like someone will suffer if you're not vigilant. This comes from a childhood where real harm occurred when you weren't paying attention, where crises happened because the adults weren't managing things. So your brain learned, if I don't handle this, no one will. Neuroscience shows that children who take on adult responsibilities early develop overdeveloped prefrontal cortex activity, the part responsible for planning, decision-making, and impulse control. Your brain matured too quickly in some areas while staying underdeveloped in others, and now, as an adult, you can't turn it off. You manage other people's lives, anticipate their needs, solve their problems. And the moment you try to stop, anxiety floods in, because stopping feels dangerous. Like something terrible will happen if you're not in control. People think this makes you type A, organized, a natural leader. But what they don't see is the exhaustion, the constant mental load, the inability to ever truly rest because part of you is always on duty. And here's the cruel part. When you finally do ask for help, you feel like you're failing because you learned early that needing support means you're not doing enough. The second trait is one that sounds positive but is actually devastating. Premature emotional intelligence. You can read a room instantly. You know what someone needs before they ask. You can manage the emotional temperature of any situation. You're the person people come to when they're falling apart because you always know what to say. But here's what nobody tells you. This didn't develop naturally. It developed as a defense mechanism. When you're a child in an unstable home, reading emotions becomes survival. You learn to track your parents' mood so you could avoid conflict. You learn to soothe, mediate, translate. You became the emotional regulator for people who should have been regulating you. Psychology calls this emotional parentification. You weren't just doing practical tasks, you were managing the psychological stability of your household, and that role never ended. Even now, you're still doing it, smoothing over tension, making sure everyone else is okay, carrying other people's feelings because they can't carry them themselves. But here's the cost. You have no idea how to process your own emotions because you never learned. Your feelings were always secondary, inconvenient, something to suppress so you could focus on everyone else. So you're brilliant at holding space for others. But when someone asks how you're doing, you freeze because you don't actually know. You've spent so long disconnected from your own inner world that it's become foreign territory. The third trait is the one that destroys intimacy. You developed what psychologists call compulsive self-sufficiency. You don't just prefer to do things alone. You physically can't let people help you. Receiving support feels uncomfortable, vulnerable, even dangerous. Why? Because in childhood, depending on others led to disappointment. The people who were supposed to take care of you didn't. So your brain built a rule: never need anyone, never expect anything, never rely on someone who might let you down. And now, even when safe people offer genuine help, your nervous system rejects it. You say you're fine when you're drowning. You handle everything yourself, even when it's breaking you. You isolate not because you want to, but because vulnerability feels like death. This makes relationships nearly impossible because intimacy requires interdependence. It requires admitting you need someone. And every time you get close to that, your brain screams danger and you pull back. People think you're strong, independent, self-made. But what you actually are is alone, not by choice, but by conditioning. And the loneliest part is that you don't even know how to ask for what you need because you never learned that your needs mattered. The fourth trait is something that sounds like wisdom but is actually grief. You have a deep, a pervasive sense of disillusionment. You don't believe in fairy tales. You don't trust easily. You don't expect the world to be fair or people to be good. You see through facades, detect manipulation, and anticipate betrayal before it happens. This makes you perceptive, realistic, hard to fool, but it also means you lost something precious: the ability to hope without cynicism, to trust without suspicion, to believe in goodness without waiting for the other shoe to drop. Psychology calls this accelerated loss of innocence. While other children were protected from harsh realities, you were exposed to them too early. You saw addiction, mental illness, financial collapse, betrayal, things a child's mind isn't equipped to process. So you adapted by becoming wise. But wisdom at 7 feels different than wisdom at 30. It's not earned through experience, it's forced through trauma. And it leaves you with a permanent sense that you're older than you are, that you've lived more than one lifetime, that you can never quite connect with people your own age because you grew up in a different reality. The fifth trait is the one that makes you feel broken. You have profound difficulty experiencing joy, not because you're depressed, though you might be, but because joy requires presence, and presence requires feeling safe, and you never learn to feel safe. Even in good moments, part of you is waiting for disaster. You can't fully relax into happiness because your nervous system is scanning for threats. You can't be spontaneous because spontaneity feels reckless. You can't be carefree because care was always your job. Neuroscience shows that chronic childhood stress affects the brain's reward system. Your dopamine pathways learn to prioritize vigilance over pleasure. So even when good things happen, your brain doesn't register them as fully rewarding. This is why celebrations feel hollow, why achievements don't satisfy, why you can be successful on paper but still feel empty. Because your nervous system was never wired for joy, it was wired for survival. And the cruelest part is that people judge you for it. They tell you to lighten up, to enjoy life, to stop being so serious, as if you chose this, as if you're not desperately trying to access a feeling that was never installed in your system. The sixth and final trait is the one that breaks my heart every time. You carry a deep, unshakable belief that you are fundamentally unlovable, not because you lack worth, but because love, in your experience, has always been conditional. It came when you were useful, when you performed, when you took care of others, but it disappeared when you had needs of your own. So you learned that your value lies in what you provide, not in who you are. That love is something you earn through service, not something you receive for existing. Psychology calls this conditional positive regard, and it creates a devastating internal logic. If I stop being useful, I stop being worthy of love. This is why you overfunction in relationships, why you give until you're empty, why you stay in situations that hurt you. Because on some level, you believe that if you stop giving, you'll be abandoned. And the worst part is, you're often right. Because you unconsciously choose people who reinforce this pattern, people who take without giving, who need you but don't see you, who love what you do for them but not who you are. Not because you're masochistic, but because familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar love. Now let's talk about what nobody tells you. These 6 traits, hyperresponsibility, premature emotional intelligence, compulsive self-sufficiency, disillusionment, inability to feel joy, and conditional self-worth, they didn't make you strong, they made you survive. And there's a difference. Strength is a choice. Survival is a necessity. You didn't choose these traits. They were installed in you by circumstances you had no control over. And treating them like strengths ignores the fact that they came at an enormous cost. You lost your childhood. You lost the developmental stage where you should have been learning to play, to trust, to depend on others. Instead, you learned to manage, to protect, to carry. And that loss doesn't just disappear when you turn 18. It lives in your body, in your nervous system, in the way you move through the world with one foot always on the brake, waiting for disaster. So here's what needs to be said clearly. You were robbed, not by your own weakness, not by your inability to cope, but by adults who failed to do their job, who placed burdens on you that should never have been yours to carry. And the fact that you survived it doesn't make it okay. The fact that you developed skills doesn't justify what was taken from you. You deserve to be a child, to be protected, to be allowed to make mistakes without catastrophic consequences, to have your needs met instead of meeting everyone else's, and you didn't get that, and it's okay to grieve it. So where does this leave you now? Because these patterns don't just disappear with awareness, they're etched into your nervous system. They're your default programming. But here's the truth. You can learn new patterns, not by erasing the old ones, but by building alongside them. You can learn that rest is not abandonment, that needing help is not failure, that your worth exists independent of your usefulness, that joy is not frivolous, that love can be unconditional. But it requires something incredibly difficult. It requires letting yourself be cared for. And for someone who grew up too fast, that feels like the most vulnerable thing in the world. Because being cared for means admitting you needed it all along. It means acknowledging that you shouldn't have had to do it alone. It means grieving the child who never got to be protected. And that grief is enormous. It's the grief of a stolen childhood, of innocence lost, of needs unmet, of a version of yourself who never got to exist. But on the other side of that grief is something you've never experienced, the possibility of being fully yourself without having to earn it. So if you recognize yourself in these 6 traits, hear this. You are not too much. You are not too broken. You are not beyond repair. You are someone who survived something that should have destroyed you, and you did it by becoming capable, aware, and strong in ways most people will never understand. But you don't have to keep surviving. You don't have to keep carrying the world. You don't have to keep being the adult in the room, because you already did that, for years, for a lifetime, and you were a child when you did it. And now, maybe for the first time, you can let yourself be held. You can let yourself rest. You can let yourself need. Not because you're weak, but because you finally have the space to stop being strong. And that space, that's where healing begins.